The form was wrong. That was the first thing Nora noticed, not the smell, not the fluorescent buzz overhead, not the way Detective Hale's cologne hit the air before he did. It was the form. Chain of Custody, case number 2021 CR 4471, line 14. The weight listed for Exhibit 7B was 218 grams. But the intake log from 11 months ago, the one she'd pulled because the system flagged a reconciliation error, said 231. 13 grams, gone somewhere between booking and storage. She was still staring at it when the door swung open. Hale didn't look at her. He moved to the counter the way men like him always moved, like the room had been waiting for him, like the air owed him something. 52 years old, 2 inches over 6 feet, the kind of build that still turned heads even though the definition had softened under his shirt. His hair was silver at the temples. His tie was loosened just enough to look deliberate. He set a styrofoam cup on the counter and slid the retrieval request across the laminate without making eye contact. 7B, he said, Hector Ramos case. Nora looked at the slip, she looked at the form in her hand, she set the form face down on her desk. Give me a sec, she said. She pulled the key from the drawer, walked back through the cage door into the evidence room, shelves floor to ceiling, everything in numbered bags and boxes, a hum from the climate control that never fully went away, and found the Ramos shelf on row 11. The bag was there. White evidence bag, zip-sealed, initials on the seal. She checked the tag. She noted the current weight on her clipboard. She carried it back out. Hale was on his phone. He glanced up when she set the bag on the counter, looked at it the way you look at something you already know is yours, and signed the retrieval form without asking any questions. He was back through the door in 40 seconds. Nora stood at the counter for a moment longer than she needed to. She wrote the weight on her clipboard, then she wrote the number from the intake log, then she wrote the number from the chain of custody amendment filed in March. She underlined all three. She looked at the underlines for a long time. Then she filed everything where it belonged and went back to her computer. Kellerton was not a city that looked like anything from the outside. Off I-35 between San Antonio and Austin, it sat in the low heat of central Texas like something that hadn't quite decided what it wanted to be, too big to be a town, too modest to be a city, the kind of place that had a Whataburger on every major intersection and a mural downtown that nobody could agree had been a good idea. The county seat, Pop, 89,000. One courthouse, one jail, one evidence facility attached to the back of the police department on Medina Street, where Nora had worked for 6 years. She'd come to the job sideways. Criminal justice degree from UT San Antonio, 2 semesters of law school she'd left when her mother got sick, a year of paralegal work for a defense firm that paid her barely enough to keep her apartment. The evidence clerk job paid better and had health insurance. She'd told herself it was temporary. 6 years had a way of making temporary into something else. She was not the kind of person people remembered when they left a room. Not because she was unremarkable, she was in fact sharp in ways that had started to irritate people who needed things to move smoothly, but because she had learned, somewhere around year 2, that the less noise she made, the more she could see. She was 38, medium height, dark hair she kept back in a low bun during work hours. Her desk was organized in a way that looked casual but wasn't. She kept a notepad in her left drawer that wasn't for work. It had been there almost 8 months. The Ramos case. She'd first noticed the Ramos file in October when she was doing a routine quarterly audit. These were supposed to happen every 90 days, but in practice they happened when Sergeant Castillo remembered to schedule them, which meant they happened about twice a year, and usually involved Nora doing the actual work while Castillo walked through once and signed off. In October she'd found the weight discrepancy. She'd flagged it internally, filled out the variance form, left it in Castillo's inbox. In November, she found the variance form in the recycling bin next to Castillo's desk, still blank. She didn't say anything. She filed a copy in her own records, made a note on her pad, and kept working. In December, she found a second discrepancy. Different case, Delgadillo 2020 CR 7889. A baggie of methamphetamine tagged at 44 grams on intake. Current weight 39.5 grams. The retrieval log for that exhibit showed 2 checkouts. One by the original arresting officer for court purposes before the case resolved. One by Marcus Hale 3 months after the conviction with ongoing investigation related activity written in the purpose field. She looked up the Delgadillo case. Roberto Delgadillo, 31, convicted of possession with intent to distribute, 8 years, currently serving at the Connolly unit in Beeville. Hale hadn't been the arresting officer on that case. He hadn't been listed anywhere in the case file. There was no ongoing investigation that referenced Delgadillo's name in any of the open case files she had access to. She wrote it down. In January, a third case. In February, 2 more. By the time Hale came in for the Ramos bag in March, Nora had 5 cases in her notepad. 19 total grams unaccounted for across those 5 cases, spread over 18 months. 5 instances of Hale's signature on retrieval logs where his name appeared nowhere in the primary case files. Small enough amounts in each individual case to pass as measurement variance. The scales they used in booking weren't laboratory grade, and a gram or two either direction could be atmospheric, could be human error, could be 100 things. But the pattern wasn't atmospheric. Patterns weren't. She hadn't told anyone yet, she wasn't sure who to tell. The police department on Medina Street was a 3-story concrete building that had been renovated twice since the 90s and still looked like it hadn't been renovated at all. The break room smelled permanently of burnt coffee and someone's lunch from 2 days ago. The parking lot in the back flooded every time it rained because the drainage had never been properly fixed, and every year the facility's budget went to something else. Nora's office, if you could call it that, it was more of a windowed alcove off the evidence cage, looked out onto the parking lot, which meant she spent a lot of her day watching patrol cars come and go in the heat. She'd been at the department long enough to know its rhythms, who was having trouble at home, who drank, who was careful with paperwork and who wasn't. The detectives upstairs mostly ignored her unless they needed something. She was a function like the copier or the HVAC, present, necessary, unremarked upon. Hale was different from the rest of them in ways she'd noticed long before she started noticing the numbers. He was well-liked, that was the first thing. The kind of well-liked that came from something performed and practiced, from years of knowing exactly what to say and when to say it, and more importantly what to withhold. He brought donuts on Fridays sometimes. He told stories at retirement parties that made the room laugh at the right moments. He'd been a Kellerton detective for 23 years, and in that time he'd cleared cases at a rate the department loved to put in press releases. Solved. Closed. Off the board. What she'd noticed before the numbers was the way he talked about the people he arrested. Not with cruelty, nothing so obvious as that, it was more like erasure. The people in his cases became shorthand. That meth thing on Culebra, the Ramos situation, as if they'd never been anything but problems to be categorized and filed away. She'd watched him stand at the counter one afternoon 2 years ago, talking to another detective about a case he'd just closed, and the man he'd put away for it came up exactly once, referred to as that piece of work, and then Hale moved on to talking about where he was taking his wife for their anniversary. It wasn't evil. It was just a particular kind of indifference, the kind that came from never having had to think of the other person as a person. She thought about that now in March, standing at her kitchen counter at 10:30 at night, her notepad open in front of her. She looked up all 5 of the men. 2 were still incarcerated. 1 had been released and was, according to a local news article, living with his sister in Laredo. 1 had died in custody, medical, respiratory, 14 months into a 6-year sentence. The last one, a man named Curtis Briggs, had been acquitted at trial, which meant whatever was in his evidence bag hadn't mattered in the end, but it had still been touched. 19 grams, maybe it went home in his pocket, maybe it went somewhere else. Maybe she was wrong about all of it and there was a mundane explanation she hadn't thought of yet. She made herself consider that. She sat with it. She was not the kind of person who ran toward conclusions. She'd seen in 2 years at the defense firm what happened when people ran toward conclusions, the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time, and someone with a badge certain enough to make a career out of that certainty. She did not want to be that. But she also could not make the numbers go away. She closed the notepad. She washed her glass. She stood at the window for a while, looking at the yellow light from the parking lot of the apartment complex across the street, and she thought about a dead man in Beeville and a missing 13 grams and what exactly you were supposed to do with something like that. She called the Texas Ranger office in San Antonio first. Not because she was certain that was the right call, but because it felt like the most neutral ground, not the department's internal affairs, not the DA's office, which worked closely enough with Kellerton PD that the news would travel before anything else did. A ranger, state level, far enough away. The woman who answered was pleasant and told her to hold. The man who eventually picked up asked her to describe the nature of her concern. She described it as carefully as she could, with specifics, case numbers, dates, weights, signatures. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. At the end he said, Okay, ma'am, I want to make sure I understand. You're talking about discrepancies in evidence weights. Is it possible these could be measurement errors? I've thought about that, she said. In isolation, yes, together, I don't think so. Are you prepared to provide copies of the documents?
Yes.
Are you employed currently by the department in question?
Yes.
A pause. I'm going to give you a case number for the complaint. Someone will contact you. Nobody contacted her for 3 weeks. When they did, it was a phone call, 20 minutes, professional and not unfriendly, and at the end of it she was told they were reviewing the information and would be in touch. She thanked the ranger and hung up and sat very still in her car in the parking lot of a Kroger for about 5 minutes before she drove home. She did not stop looking. She had access as evidence clerk to the logs for the entire facility, not the full investigative files, but the intake and retrieval records, the chain of custody documentation, the inventory audits. She went through 2 years of Hale's retrieval history over the course of 3 evenings, carefully, not rushing, pulling only what she'd have legitimate reason to pull for audit purposes. She found 8 more cases with his signature on retrieval logs in which his name didn't appear in the primary file. 3 of those had weight discrepancies, 2 of those had weight discrepancies in drug evidence. She also found something else. In 2020, a man named Darnell Pruitt had been convicted of second-degree murder, stabbing death on the South Side, a disagreement outside a bar called Palomino's that had ended with a man named Terrence Witt bleeding out on the sidewalk at 147. Pruitt maintained throughout, before and after conviction, that he had not been there. His defense attorney had submitted an alibi witnesses who placed him 3 miles away, at a convenience store at the relevant time. The jury had deliberated for 11 hours and come back with guilty. The key piece of physical evidence at trial, a folding knife recovered from a dumpster 1 block from the scene, which had Witt's blood on the blade and a single partial fingerprint on the handle that the prosecution's expert had testified was consistent with Pruitt's right index finger. Hale had been the lead detective on the case. The knife was Exhibit 3A in the Pruitt case file. She pulled the retrieval log. Hale had checked it out 4 months before trial, standard enough for a detective preparing testimony, and returned it 6 days later. What she noticed, because she was looking, was that the seal on the bag in the current inventory was not the original seal. The original seal's lot number was recorded on the intake sheet. The current bag had a different lot number. Different batch of evidence bags, different manufacture date. The lot number encoded that information if you knew how to read it. She stared at that for a long time. The seal might have been broken and resealed for legitimate reasons during an approved examination, for instance. There was a form for that. She searched for the form. There was no form, no documentation of an authorized unsealing, nothing in the log except the single checkout entry and the return 6 days later. Darnell Pruitt was in the Polunsky unit in Livingston. He had been there for 3 years. He was 34 years old. She started keeping the notepad off-site. At home, in the box under her bed where she kept documents she didn't want to lose: her mother's death certificate, her old lease agreements, her law school transcripts from the semester and a half she'd completed. Meticulous, cross-referenced. She wasn't building a legal case, she knew she wasn't qualified for that, but she was building something. A record, something that couldn't be unseen. At work she was normal. This was easier than she expected, which worried her. She spoke to Hale the same way she always had, which was briefly and professionally and without expression. He spoke to her the same way, which was to say barely. She was furniture to him. She had understood that before any of this started, and she understood now that it was the thing most likely to keep her safe. Castillo was harder. Castillo was not corrupt. She'd thought about this carefully, and she didn't think he was, not actively, but he was compliant in the way that some people were compliant, which was to say he had learned over 20 years to look in the direction he was pointed and not further. He had recycled her variance form. Whether he'd done that because someone asked him to or because he genuinely thought it wasn't worth the trouble, she couldn't know. Either way, he was not someone she could go to. She had a friend, had is probably the wrong word, someone she'd known long enough, named Patricia Acaffer, who worked in the Bixar County DA's office 40 miles south. They'd met at a conference 3 years ago and kept an occasional touch, the kind of friendship that existed mostly in text messages and a lunch every few months when their schedules aligned. Patricia was sharp and careful and had no connection to Kellerton. One afternoon in April, Nora called her. She did not tell Patricia what she had. She asked, instead, a question: if a county-level employee believed they had evidence of systematic misconduct by a law enforcement officer, evidence tampering potentially, and they didn't trust local internal affairs and the Rangers had gone quiet. What would their options be? Patricia was quiet for a moment. How serious?
Serious.
Potential wrongful conviction serious. Nora looked at the wall of her office. Possibly. FBI, Patricia said. Public Corruption Unit. They have a field office in San Antonio. They can operate independently of local agencies and they're not going to slow roll it the way a ranger might if it's complicated politically. But Nora, a pause. If this is what it sounds like, you need to think about what happens to you while it's being investigated. These things don't move fast, and in the meantime you're still going to work every day.
I know.
Do you have documentation?
Yes.
Keep it somewhere they can't get to it, and don't talk to anyone at that department, not anyone. Nora thanked her. She hung up. She thought about the man in Livingston, 3 years into a sentence for a murder she was increasingly certain he hadn't committed, and she made the call to the FBI 2 days later. Special Agent Denise Caro was 41, originally from Ohio, with a flat affect and a habit of taking notes with the kind of quiet efficiency that made you feel like you were being filed away while she was still smiling at you. She drove down from the San Antonio field office on a Thursday morning and met Nora at a Panera in New Braunfels, 12 miles from Kellerton, at 7:30 a.m. before Nora's shift. Nora had brought copies of everything. Not the originals, she'd photographed and printed those, organized in a manila folder with a 2-page summary she'd typed out at home. Caro read the summary. She looked through the copies. She asked without inflection whether Nora had shared this with anyone at the department. Nora said no. Whether she'd shared it with anyone connected to the department, current or former employees, no. Whether she had any personal relationship with any of the defendants in the listed cases, no. Then Caro asked her about the Prout evidence bag, specifically about how she'd determined the seal lot numbers were different. Nora explained. Caro wrote something down. She asked how long it had taken Nora to develop this documentation, and Nora said about 5 months, and Caro nodded like 5 months was neither short nor long. I want to be clear about how this works, Caro said. She had her hands flat on the table, not on the folder. If we open a formal investigation, it can take a long time, months, possibly more than a year. During that time, nothing visible changes on your end. You go to work, you do your job, you do not collect additional evidence, you do not tell anyone, you do not confront the subject or do anything that could compromise either the investigation or your own safety. You understand that?
Yes.
If someone at the department figures out you made contact with us, I understand the risk. Caro looked at her for a moment, not in a testing way, more like she was putting something into storage. We're going to need to get into that evidence room, she said. Without announcing ourselves, which means we'll need a federal warrant, and the warrant requires probable cause, and what you've given me is a strong start on probable cause, but I want you to be realistic about the timeline. Nora said she was realistic. Caro picked up the folder. One more thing, she said. The Prout case, you believe the evidence was tampered with before trial. Is there anything else in the file, anything you have access to that speaks to the alibi witness? Nora had thought about this, not directly, but the alibi witness recanted before trial. It's in the public record. She said she'd been mistaken about the timing. That's all I know. Caro made another note. She thanked Nora and told her she'd be in contact through a personal email address she wrote on a napkin. She left before Nora's coffee was finished. Nora sat there for 10 minutes after she left, watching the parking lot through the window. A woman was loading groceries into a Honda Civic. A kid was chasing a loose napkin across the pavement. Everything was very ordinary. She drove to work and processed 47 chain of custody forms and ate her lunch at her desk, and did not look at Marcus Hale when he passed the cage at 3:15 in the afternoon, talking on his phone, walking like the building was holding itself slightly out of his way. The thing about Marcus Hale was that he believed he was right. This was not a theory Nora had developed. It was something she'd come to understand by watching him over 6 years in small, accumulating ways, the way he talked about closed cases, the flatness behind the satisfaction when he said a name and a charge and a conviction in the same breath. He was not a man who felt doubt the way some men carried it visibly in their shoulders. He carried something else instead, a kind of settled certainty that bordered on serenity. He'd grown up in Kellerton, graduated from the high school 3 miles from the department. His father had been a highway patrolman for 30 years. He joined the force at 22, made detective at 30, homicide at 36. His clearance rate was real, he worked hard, he was genuinely skilled at the psychological architecture of an interrogation, he read people well. That part was not constructed. He had, over 23 years, solved real crimes and put away people who had actually done things. The problem, she thought, not that she'd been asked, not that her thinking meant anything practically, was that somewhere in those 23 years the line between knowing and believing had dissolved. He'd gotten good enough at reading guilt that he'd stopped distinguishing between reading it and deciding it. A man who looked like he'd done it, who fit the pattern, who lived in the right zip code and had the right priors and gave off the right particular frequency of evasion when questioned, that man became, for Hale, effectively guilty. And from there it was a small step. A partial print with ambiguous lab results, shaded in a testimony as more conclusive than it was. A knife that needed to be in a particular place to close a case that needed to be closed. A witness whose statement had enough uncertainty in it that a phone call, a quiet, patient, "Here's what I think you meant to say" phone call could redirect it into something more useful. He wasn't doing it for money mostly. That was the thing she'd had to sit with because money would have been simpler. Money was a motive she understood. The 13 grams and the occasional skim from evidence, that was probably money, yes, or favors or something transactional she hadn't mapped yet. But the knife, the Prout case, she didn't think that was money. She thought that was something older and more stubborn, the need to be the man who solved things, the man the department held up, the man at retirement parties who got the long applause. She thought about that when she passed him in the parking lot at the end of her shift one afternoon in May and he held the door for her, automatic and courteous, and she said thank you, and he said have a good evening, and they parted ways, and neither of them was anything to the other. The investigation moved the way Caro had warned her it would, which is to say it moved, but she couldn't see it moving. In the first 6 weeks after their meeting, Nora heard nothing. She went to work, she processed forms. She ran her quarterly audit, the first Castillo had scheduled since she'd filed her first variance report, and she did it carefully and thoroughly and found 2 more small discrepancies in cases unrelated to Hale, which she documented and flagged through proper channels and which felt completely hollow. In June, Caro emailed, "A single line, process is moving, continue status quo." In July, Castillo came into her office one morning and told her the department was looking at updating the evidence management software to a new system, which would mean transitioning all the current records. He said it with the mildly triumphant air of someone who'd been advocating for it for a while. She smiled and said that sounded like a good update. After he left, she sat very still and thought about what a software transition meant for records and whether that was coincidence and whether she was being paranoid. She emailed Caro that afternoon. Caro called her that evening. "We know about the software transition," she said. "It's been in the budget proposal for 2 years, it's not related." "Okay," Nora said. "But I'm glad you told me." A pause. "We're close to moving on the warrant. There are some things we're verifying that I can't get into. Keep doing what you're doing." In August, she was auditing the inventory when she found something new, not a weight discrepancy. A case file from 2019, a drug possession case which should have had 4 items in evidence: cash, 2 bags of narcotics, a cell phone. The phone was missing, not checked out, not transferred, just not there. The inventory number existed in the system. The shelf tag was there. But the bag behind it contained an unrelated envelope of cash that belonged, per its own tag, to a different case entirely. She stood in the evidence room for a long time, holding the envelope, looking at the empty hook where the phone should have been. She photographed everything. She put the envelope back. She walked back to her desk and wrote up the discrepancy as a standard inventory error. It happened, occasionally, items got misfiled and logged it in the system and then pulled the retrieval history for that case. Hale 2021, checked out for 6 days. The warrant came in September. She didn't know about it until it was already in motion. She was at her desk on a Tuesday morning, 8:40 a.m., when the building's side door opened and 4 people she'd never seen walked in with Castillo behind them looking like someone had been sitting on his chest. 2 of them were in jackets with FBI across the back. 2 were in civilian clothes. Caro was one of them. Nora had been told in their last communication 2 weeks prior that when this happened she should continue working normally, and that someone would speak with her separately. She continued working normally. This was one of the harder things she'd ever done. The evidence room was sealed. An FBI evidence technician spent 3 hours in there while Caro and another agent set up in the conference room on the second floor. Castillo was in with them for 45 minutes. When he came out, his face was the color of wet concrete. He walked past her desk and into his office and closed the door. Just before noon, a junior detective named Reyes, who Nora had always found decent, came down and told her quietly that the FBI wanted to speak with her at 2 o'clock. She nodded. She ate a granola bar at her desk because she had forgotten to bring lunch. She watched the clock. Hale wasn't there. He'd been off-site all morning. Someone, she heard it in the hallway, a patrol officer talking to another patrol officer near the break room, not bothering to be quiet, had said he'd been pulled into a meeting at a location she didn't catch. She didn't ask. At 2 o'clock she went upstairs. Caro was in the conference room with another agent she introduced as Garza. Caro was in the same flat-effect professional mode as always. Garza was younger, took notes, said nothing except at the very end. Caro thanked her first, and Nora said that was fine. Then Caro walked her through the investigation from their side, not all of it, but enough what they'd found in the evidence room, what the chain of custody analysis had produced, what they needed to confirm with her testimony. The questions were specific: dates, access logs, her own actions and decisions over the past 8 months, whether she had touched any evidence, altered any records, influenced any documentation beyond what her job required. No. Caro asked about the Prout knife, specifically what she'd noticed, how she'd noticed it. Nora explained the lot numbers again, clearly and exactly. Caro made a note. The alibi witness, Caro said, Bernadette Coles, are you familiar with that name? Nora said she wasn't, beyond knowing the public record of the recantation. She's been cooperative with us, Caro said. It was all she said about it, and her face didn't change. Garza asked the one question he asked near the end. In the course of your work over the past 8 months, did Detective Hale ever indicate to you, directly or indirectly, that he was aware of your concerns about the evidence records? No, Nora said. To your knowledge, did anyone at the department? No. Garza wrote something down. They thanked her again. Caro told her she might be needed for a federal grand jury proceeding and that her documentation, which they had now officially received and logged, would be part of the evidentiary record. She told her to expect a call from a victim witness coordinator. Nora walked back down the stairs. She poured herself a cup of the bad coffee. She drank it at her desk. She could hear from somewhere upstairs the low murmur of voices she couldn't identify. Hale was placed on administrative leave that afternoon. She heard about it through the building's informal circuitry, which was faster and more reliable than any official communication. A woman named Sandra who worked in records who had heard it from a lieutenant who had been in the building when it happened. Hale had come back at 1:30, she said. He'd gone up to the 3rd floor. He'd been in there for about 20 minutes. When he came out, he'd walked to his desk, gotten his keys, and left. Nora didn't ask for details. She went home at 5, made pasta she didn't taste, and watched the news without watching it. The story wasn't public yet. It wouldn't be for a few more weeks. She thought that night about what Hale's drive home had looked like. Whether he'd called his wife from the car or waited until he was inside. Whether he understood yet the full shape of what was coming, or whether he was still in the stage where a person tells themselves it's manageable, it can be explained. There's an angle that makes this something other than what it is. She thought about Darnell Prout in Livingston. She did not know him. She didn't know what he'd been doing with his life before that bar on the south side, didn't know his mother's name or whether he had kids, didn't know what 3 years inside had done to him. She knew his case number and his booking photo and a partial print on a knife that a federal evidence technician was currently analyzing in ways that would eventually become a court document. She turned off the lights. She did not feel victorious. She wasn't sure what she felt. It went federal in November. The U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Texas filed a 12-count indictment against Marcus Allen Hale, civil rights violations under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and 2 counts of drug theft from federal evidence. Kellerton received federal DEA task force funding that brought the evidence under a federal nexus. The indictment was unsealed on a Wednesday morning, and by noon it was on every local news station, and by the following morning it had made the Associated Press. Nora was at work when the AP story ran. Her phone didn't stop for 2 days. She didn't talk to the media. She'd been told not to, and beyond that she didn't want to. There were reporters parked outside the department building, and she walked past them with her head down the way she always walked, and they didn't know her, and she got inside without incident. The department issued a statement through the chief's office expressing shock and commitment to accountability, which everyone read and few believed. Internal Affairs opened parallel proceedings. A city council member who'd been elected on a public safety platform called a press conference. A retired detective went on a local news program and said he'd always had doubts about Hale's methods, which Nora found deeply unpersuasive since the man had served alongside Hale for 16 years and filed no concerns. In December, the Innocence Project made contact regarding Darnell Pruitt. The federal case and the Innocence Review ran on separate tracks. The federal case moved at federal speed, which is slower than television but faster than most things. Hale's attorney, a former prosecutor from Austin named Brennan, expensive, contained, good at making everything sound procedural, filed 3 motions in the first month. Caro testified before the grand jury in January. Nora testified before the grand jury in February in San Antonio, in a room with 16 people she didn't know and a federal prosecutor who asked her questions she answered carefully and factually, and as precisely as the documents she'd kept aloud. It took 45 minutes. When she came out into the hallway, her hands were shaking slightly. She hadn't noticed until she looked down. The Pruitt matter moved more slowly, through the mechanisms that innocence cases always moved through: the post-conviction court filings, the DNA testing of the knife, a newer, more sensitive analysis than the one used in the original trial, the re-examination of the partial fingerprint. The alibi witness, Bernadette Coles, submitted a new sworn statement. She had recanted, she said, after a phone call from a detective she now named as Marcus Hale, who had suggested, not overtly, not as a threat exactly, more as a patient reframing of what she remembered, that she might have been confused about the time and that her original statement might cause problems for her given a minor outstanding warrant the city had on file for her. The warrant had been for an unpaid traffic fine. She had been 26 years old at the time. Nora didn't read all of this as it happened. She got pieces of it. Caro kept her peripherally informed, what she needed to know and not more, and she put the pieces together the way she'd put everything together, carefully, in her own time. The trial date was set for September of the following year. In the months before it, life at the department changed in ways that were invisible from outside and very visible from inside. The new evidence management software was installed, and with it came tighter protocols and an auditing system that flagged anomalies automatically, which Castillo had praised in the implementation meeting as a great improvement, which Nora had sat through without comment. 3 officers who'd worked closely with Hale were transferred or quietly reassigned. Reyes was promoted to detective, which she thought was probably the right call. A new hire came into the evidence unit, young woman named Flores, 25, from the criminal justice program at Texas State, and Nora trained her on the inventory system and the audit procedures and the importance of the log. Flores asked her once, not quite directly, if it was true that she'd been the one who'd found it, the thing with Hale. People were saying it in the building. I did my job, Nora said. It wasn't false modesty. It was the only honest answer she had. She'd thought sometimes in the months since about the day she'd found the first number, the 218 versus the 231. She'd been looking at a routine reconciliation error flag. She'd pulled the file because the system told her to. She had not been looking for anything. She had found it because she'd been paying attention to the most ordinary possible task, which was making sure the numbers matched. She thought about that a lot. The trial ran for 9 days in October. Nora testified for 2.5 hours on the 4th day. She wore a gray blazer she'd bought specifically for the occasion and sat in the witness box with her hands in her lap and spoke clearly and without drama. Brennan cross-examined her for 50 minutes. And he was good at his job. He pressed on measurement variance, on the limits of her technical expertise, on whether she had reason to bear any animus toward Detective Hale, on the possibility that what she'd interpreted as a pattern was in fact a series of independent administrative failures. She answered each question the same way without emotion. What she had observed, what she had documented, what the numbers said. She did not elaborate beyond the question, she did not look at Hale. She looked at him once at the end of her testimony when she was stepping down from the box. Not because she'd planned to. It just happened her eye passed across the defense table and he was there, and for half a second they were looking at the same direction. He looked like himself, that was the strange thing. He looked like the man who came to the evidence counter, who held the door, who told stories at retirement parties. He did not look diminished. He looked like he was in the middle of a problem he was managing, which was perhaps all he'd ever looked like. She walked out of the courtroom and stood in the hallway for a moment, hand against the wall. Then she went to find a cup of water. The jury returned guilty on 9 of 12 counts. 2 of the obstruction counts were dismissed during the trial on technical grounds. 1 civil rights count relating to a case where the federal nexus was thinner was acquitted. The drug theft counts both guilty. The evidence tampering counts guilty. Sentencing was set for January. Federal sentencing guidelines for civil rights violations under color of law, when the violation involves a murder conviction, even a state-level conviction being reviewed in a parallel proceeding, are not light. Brennan argued for the lower end. The AUSA argued for consecutive terms. The judge took 2 weeks and came back with 18 years. Hale would be eligible for parole consideration after 15. The room where Nora watched the sentencing was the same room where she'd testified in October. She sat in the gallery near the back, and when the judge read the sentence she felt something that was not triumph. Something quieter and less clean. The feeling you get at the end of a long drive in bad weather, not joy exactly, more like the relief of stopping, mixed with the ache of what the drive had cost you. Hale didn't say anything when the sentence came down. His wife, who had been in the gallery for parts of the trial, wasn't there for the sentencing. Nora had thought about that woman occasionally, had never met her, knew nothing about her except that she existed and had been married to this man for, according to the news coverage, 28 years. She was not a villain in any story Nora could tell. She was just a person whose life had broken in a particular direction. Darnell Pruitt's post-conviction petition was still pending when the federal sentence came down. The DNA results from the knife had been inconclusive, not exculpatory in themselves, but the absence of his DNA in a more sensitive test, combined with the witness recantation and the evidence of tampering, was enough that the case was going back before a judge. His attorney, whom the Innocence Project had connected him with, was confident. Nora didn't know how confident to be. She understood that the legal system moved in its own registers at its own pace, and that confidence was not a guarantee. She hoped. She did not know what else to do with hopping except to let it exist alongside everything else. In late January, she cleaned out her notepad. She'd kept it under the bed for almost a year by that point. She sat on the floor with the box and went through it, the case numbers, the dates, the weights, the cross-references, the photographs she'd printed and slipped between the pages. She went through it slowly, not reading exactly, more like reviewing. The whole 8 months compressed into 60 pages of careful handwriting and printed forms. She didn't throw it away. She put it back in the box with her mother's death certificate and her law school transcripts. She applied to law school in February. Not because of the case, or not only because of it. Because she was 39 and the thing she'd spent the past year doing, which was following a thread of paper wherever it went and trusting that the truth was there if you were methodical enough to find it, had felt like the first work in a long time that fit the dimensions of what she actually was. She got in. She didn't tell many people. She told Patricia, who was genuinely glad. She told her landlord, who was less interested, and Flores at the evidence unit, who said that was great and asked if she'd put in for her position. She had not. She thought she probably would before she left. Spring came to Kellerton the way it always did, grudgingly, with pollen and wind and a week in March that got cold again just when everyone had packed away their jackets. The courthouse on Market Street had been cleaned and reflagged for some occasion she'd missed the notice on, and the flags were bright in the dry air when she drove past on a Tuesday morning in April, windows down, on her way to Medina Street. The pecan trees on the median were putting out their first pale leaves. She parked in the back lot, which still flooded when it rained. She got her bag, she went inside. At her desk was a coffee she hadn't made. Flores had left it, presumably. A sticky note on the side that said audit reminder 10 a.m. Nora peeled the note off, read it, set it aside, and opened her computer. Outside the window, a patrol car pulled into the lot, idled for a moment, then swung out again toward the street. The engine sound faded. The parking lot was empty. She opened the day's files and started at the beginning. Darnell Prout walked out of the Polunsky unit on a Thursday morning in June, 4 years and 3 months after he'd walked in. It was 91 degrees. His sister was in the parking lot in a silver Dodge with the engine running. He'd asked her not to bring anyone else, no cameras, no gathering, and she'd respected that. He stood in the sun for a moment before he got in the car. The drive back to Laredo took 4 hours. He slept most of it. Nora didn't know any of this when it happened. She read about it 3 days later in a brief on the Innocence Project's website, a paragraph and a photograph, him standing outside the unit, one hand slightly raised against the sun. She looked at the photograph for a while. There was nothing particular in his face that she could read. He looked like a man standing in a parking lot squinting. She closed the browser. She had a deposition transcript to review for a class. She pulled it up. She read. Outside, the afternoon heat was working its way through the building in the way it did every summer, the HVAC fighting it without conviction. Someone down the hall was on the phone, not loudly, just present. The calendar on her wall said June.
She turned the page.